My name is Andy Harris. It's great to be back in Oxford. So I'm going to be talking today about a project I'm writing with Dan Posner, who's at UCLA, on distributed politics in Kenya. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the conditions under which politicians in Kenya, specifically MPs, are able to reward their supporters using targetable public goods. Distributed politics more generally from the political science world is really about, who gets what, where, and when. There's a wide variety, of course, of strategies that a member of parliament or any given politician could use to distribute resources towards some political end. So, for instance, you might try to reward your supporters, as we'll explore here, in order to gain their support or retain their support for the next election. You might try to poach your opponent's supporters. You may try to use resources to mobilize people who did not vote last time or who have recently moved into the area and haven't registered. Questions about distributed politics are materially important. Places like the UK or the US, not so much, right? We have so much developed infrastructure that a new clinic or a school probably isn't going to have a huge impact on our individual welfare. This is definitely not the case in a place like Kenya, where I study. People are poorer in the rural areas, and in some, peri-urban areas, the actual infrastructure is quite poorly developed. So a new hospital, for instance, determining where you put a new hospital actually has huge welfare implications in the sense that it determines who can get to that hospital quickly. A new school can have huge welfare implications in the sense that it really determines how far your child has to go in order to get to school every day. So in this sense, public goods that we're talking about here, schools, clinics, et cetera, aren't really public goods in the theoretical sense. That is, distance makes them excludable. If you place them far away from some populations, those populations are not going to have access to those at all. So as a political scientist, this is generally how we end up studying distributed politics. We take a big place like a country or a state, and then we divide it into polygons. In this case, and as is often the case in many contexts outside of Africa, as well as in Africa, we just use these convenient GIS files we find online. These are the administrative districts of Kenya, and we use those to aggregate up both political support, for instance, and the outcome of sort of government resources, so government spending in one of these polygons. So we might think of these red areas as core government areas, and then ask the question, do these places receive more government resources than the white areas, which could be seen as non-government areas? For those of you who know Kenya, this is just a mock-up. I'm not suggesting that these are necessarily political divisions we see on the ground. This is hugely problematic for many different reasons. Clearly, population distribution across within each of these polygons is not going to be uniform. Neither is political support. One side of the district may support the incumbent, the other may support the opposition. So we're actually masking a lot of important variation and sort of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, when we aggregate things to these levels. More to the point, and this is something that's a bit more subtle, is these polygons, be they constituencies or districts, are often drawn in ways that are a function of the actual things we're interested in. So in Kenya, we know very well from multiple sources that the way districts and constituencies are actually shaped are a function of things like ethnicity or clan, which is, of course, quite important for political outcomes. So getting past these polygons, I think, is an important thing if we really want to start to understand the sort of on-the-ground dynamics of distributed politics. So one solution, of course, is just to draw more polygons, but we really don't, get any extra traction there, right? We're just sort of multiplying the units that we have access to. Again, same story. So what did Dan and I do? What we decided to do is really see how low we could go with our data. And so what we basically did was, for each of these 210 parliamentary constituencies that we see here, we wanted to explore the allocation of resources within those constituencies, and then try to explain variation across constituencies in terms of how members of parliament distribute resources within these constituencies. So how did we do that? Well, we're we're basically using a 2003 act in Kenya that basically created a little bank account for each member of parliament where they could use the money in that kitty in order to build various development projects on the ground. This is called the Constituencies Development Fund. And from 2003 until very recently, this is precisely what members of parliament did. They used this Constituencies Development Fund, which amounted to hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars, for constituencies to build infrastructure within those constituencies. And functionally, the MP cedes control to a committee who advises and manages the implementation of these projects. During the period we're looking at, from 2003 to 2007, basically the MP had total control over this committee. So he could dissolve them, he could get rid of members that he didn't like. So as a result, the MP had quite a lot of control over actually how the implementation and where projects get placed worked within his constituencies or her constituencies. So, all right. So it's really within this context, within 210 constituencies, trying to understand variation in how an MP reward or places development projects within a constituency as a function of past support in 2002, and trying to understand that as controlling for other possible factors as well. So before we get into the details of the data, just a sense of the kind of variation that we see in these CDF fund projects across constituencies. Most of the projects are one and done kind of things. So on the y-axis, you've got just simply counts of projects, and x-axis duration in years, that is the number of years a given project was funded. The vast majority of projects there, a plurality of projects rather, just happen in 1 year and then they don't get any funding again. Very few projects go on for 3 or 4 years. In terms of the sort of magnitude of projects that are built, well, first of all, most MPs spend almost all of their money. Some of them don't. In some cases, MPs die before they have a chance to really tap it. So, or in other cases, like that zero down there was just no data available for the given constituency. I believe that was Mbakazi, if I remember correctly. The middle and the column on the right, we're simply looking at, in a sense, what's the distribution of big projects or fractionalization of project spending. And again, very few MPs go for really huge projects. There tend to be a lot of smaller projects that are allocated across the constituency. Basically another plot of the same thing. Again, we see on the left-hand side there, we have two constituencies for which there was really no data available, but for the rest, we see a huge variation in terms of the number of projects implemented across the period from 2003 at the beginning of the CDF through 2007, which was the end of the parliamentary term. This is quite an important and interesting graph for our robustness checks in the paper. The vast majority of projects were actually schools. One of the reasons for this is probably the fact that, coincident with the beginning of CDF, we also had the implementation of free primary education, which created huge additional demand for classrooms. So a vast majority of the projects that we actually see are new classrooms built onto existing schools, very few sort of brand new schools. As well as we see health and water projects. Other projects are things like roads or contribution to youth centers, et cetera, et cetera. Very small amounts were allocated to admin and bursary. This is in large part because there were caps, legal caps put on the amounts that the CDF office could actually use for things like administration and bursary purposes. All right, and just a comment on the source of our outcomes data. So, the lovely thing about the internet is that it's really easy to get a lot of geographic information quickly. Unfortunately, because we often download a data set and look at it, we have no idea where it actually came from or who assembled it, but we don't have a great sense of the quality of it. So there's opendata.go.ke, has lots of great data on Kenya, and they have a great CDF project data set. But if you download it and look at it, you basically learn very quickly it's quite fragmented. Many constituencies missing. Many of the geolocations of projects in that data set are just very poor for various reasons. So what Dan and I did was actually scraped hundreds and hundreds of pages of PDFs from the actual CDF board's national website, and then geo-referenced these projects to as exactly as we could in terms of hopefully matching them to a specific point. In the case of Mbekwa Primary School, finding Mbekwa Primary School in existing data sets, matching it to that geographic point, and we're done. In other cases, if we couldn't find the exact point, we would match it to, say, a location or a village that shared the same name, because often, most of the time, Mwakema Primary School would be located in, say, Mwakema Village. We outline this process in the paper, but at the end of the day, regardless of the quality of the georeferencing, the types of projects, we get basically the same results across a lot of different specifications. Happy to answer more questions about this stuff. Just to be really clear, the kinds of projects we're looking at are things like this. Local bridges, local water projects, local schools, lots of credit coming here, spent a lot of money on a CDF project, block of new classrooms again, in Shinyalo constituency, et cetera, et cetera. Again, local public goods that basically, by dint of their position in a constituency, the political effect, or the material welfare effects of these projects accrue to the people who live close to them. All right, so just to get a sense of our data, more specifically, we're going to focus on one constituency here. This is Eldoret South constituency in Kenya's Rift Valley. Basically, here's the border of it. As you can see, we've got Eldoret South and a bunch of points. The points are georeferenced project locations. You can see, down in the south, we actually have Kakamega Forest. Very few people live down here, therefore very few projects. Up north, we have the bottom side of Eldoret town. If we overlay it with an independent variable like population density here, we see the same story. Up north, Eldoret South town. Down here, we've got Kakamega Forest. Not many people living there. So another independent variable that we work with has to do more with feasibility. In this case, this is a raster recording to us the distance from the road to the project. So for every point on the raster, for instance here, the green means this point in the two-dimensional space is very distant from a road, whereas the wider areas here are basically right on a road. One of the things Dan and I were very happy to see when we ran a correlation between project points and road density is that there was a high correlation, which said to us, okay, at the very least, it looks like projects are ending up so that being placed where people can actually get to them, which said to us, okay, well then, at the very least, this is some plausible check on our ability to actually georeference these projects. The alternative, finding lots of projects in the middle of nowhere, that would have been a bit difficult. This is really the money independent variable, and this is a raster of political support in 2002 for the winner. And basically the bluer areas report to us low political support, and the redder areas represent for us higher political support. Now, one of the really interesting things, it's important for me to point out, these data were taken from polling station level returns. So this is very, very detailed level of data of, as detailed as you can get in terms of political outcomes in Kenya. And we combine that with data on the spatial distribution of population to get this kind of raster of the spatial distribution of political support. Now, one of the interesting things I've learned from this project is really how bad human beings are actually looking at spatial data and detecting whether or not there's a pattern between an outcome like these points where projects appear and an underlying covariate here like spatial or like electoral support. And luckily there's a statistical method, a whole series of statistical methods for looking at this in spatial data. We used a kind of Poisson model called the point process model to model the occurrence of these points in two-dimensional space as a function of the underlying spatial distribution of things like distance from roads, political support, co-ethnicity with the MP, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about some of the things I controlled for here. The idea here, these models were really born in ecology, where we're trying to model something like the occurrence of a certain kind of tree, or the appearance of a certain kind of animal as a function of underlying environmental factors like soil quality or weather. They've been used in seismology for similar work, or in criminology to detect hotspots for crime. We're simply extending this one step further and trying to look at where projects occur in two-dimensional space as a function of political support. And just to be clear, in addition to our main independent variable of political support, we're also controlling for things like feasibility, that is roads, co-ethnicity, poverty, distance to roads, as well as distance to the Member of Parliament's home village. So what do we find? You're not going to get a nice regression table from me. because remember we did this for well, actually 204 constituencies after we got rid of the two that didn't have any CDF data available, and the few where the member of parliament ran unopposed and we didn't get any elections data. This is basically what we find. On the y-axis we have each row is a constituency within Kenya, and on the x-axis is basically the regression coefficient marking the relationship between the outcome of project placement and the input of electoral support. And of course, the black line at 0 represents no relationship. The bar is basically a 95% confidence interval. And what we see is a striking result here that yeah, in most cases it looks like there's quite a bit of rewarding of one's supporters. But there's also quite a lot of variation across constituencies in the degree to which members of parliament actually reward their supporters. And as it turns out, there are a few interesting things we've learned from taking these estimates, the point estimates, and then trying to explain variation in those point estimates as a function of constituency level characteristics. And the things that really pop out for us are as follows. One of the key factors constraining a politician's ability to actually reward supporters is the spatial distribution of that support. That is, when supporters are clustered together in one area, and then they're clustered away from opponents or people who did not vote for the sitting MP. The MP, of course, is better able to target those people effectively and cheaply, rewarding them for their past support. That's not the case, of course, when the supporters are more evenly distributed across space. And this geographic constraint that we found that shows us that, yes, MPs can actually, when they're able to target their supporters, they do so, actually speaks back to one of the motivating points here, which is, do we really learn a lot about distributive politics when we're working with aerial units, that is, these administrative districts? We really do lose a lot about what's actually going on the ground when we sort of assume uniform population distribution across an area. The second thing that's really interesting is, we talk a lot about ethnicity when we talk about Africa, for better or for worse. Well, as it turns out, most constituencies are pretty much ethnically homogenous. These are small areas within Kenya, and the people who live in them tend to come from one ethnic group. So what we find in those areas is actually MPs don't really do as strong of a job differentiating between supporters and opposers. That is, we see that when opposers, that is, the people who didn't vote for the MP, live amongst the people who did support them, the MP is actually just as likely, if not more, to keep projects in that area. That is, our hypothesis there is that the MP actually sees these voters as persuadable. That is, if we give these people who did not vote for me resources, perhaps they'll vote for me next time. In ethnically heterogeneous areas, you see exactly the opposite. A huge negative effect that's significant when sort of supporters and opposers live in the same area, and MP will not put any projects there. So in a sense, almost reinforcing ethnic inequality that may or may not exist in the area. So of course this is important because the stakes are high, and at the end of the day, it's quite interesting that MPs at the end of this term, 60 to 70% of them actually lost their seats. So I think one of the theoretical questions that Dan and I are really struggling with going forward is, how do we reconcile the fact that MPs are quite attuned to where their supporters live and interested in rewarding them, but at the same time, use of these projects to reward their supporters don't really translate at the end of the day into higher re-election rates. With that, I'll close, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, let me start by saying that this is a great paper. It's very, very thorough. So I was joking beforehand that, let me turn my mic on. I was saying beforehand that, as I read the introduction, I was jotting down all my thoughts and all of my, red flags going up. Well, did you consider? Well, did you consider? And as I went through the paper, I quickly crossed those off. So It was a great paper, and there were several kind of key contributions, the first two being methodological and the other one being this empirical outcome. So it definitely improves upon the political patronage literature in terms of exploring this within constituency level variation in support of the project level. So from that angle alone, this kind of is a great contribution. And also I enjoyed this adoption of this ecological spatial model, and it improved upon the current kind of normal literature in terms of you don't need to do this crude aggregation of outcomes to the administrative level. And Andy kind of brought that up in the beginning, and also you deal with the endogeneity issues that are associated with using politically motivated administrative borders, which we try to avoid. And then again, and I think this is kind of the key contribution of the paper, and this is what he kind of showed in that very last slide, is that the spatial distribution of support matters a lot in explaining why there's that variation across constituencies in terms of whether they award or not award their supporters or their co-ethnics. So just a few kind of comments and questions. The paper's premise kind of relies on this idea that geographic proximity determines the ability to reap benefits. And, you know, in most cases, we would, you know, that works, right? However, you do want to kind of weight that considering household income levels. So he mentioned that the FPE program was introduced around the same time in 2003. And with the FPE program, the free primary education program, you had not only a lot of people that were kind of on the cusp of being middle income, transferring their students into private schools. You also had people being able to transfer within the public school system to better schools. So there is a sense that there might be cross-constituency benefits that are not specific to a geographic area, and that also people that obviously are in private education aren't going to benefit from the plastering of a new public school building or classroom. And so one way to kind of potentially account for this is to create a weighting index where you have like a local income appropriateness associated with the given projects as part of your geographic proximity. So initially he pointed out that, you know, a lot of these projects are small, they're largely short term, so these are not large infrastructure multi-year projects, and they're largely educational. And that, you know, several kind of questions came up about that in terms of the process. So in the paper, you assert that it's rather MP-led, that the MP kind of goes around and looks at different areas and says, I'm going to put in a classroom, I'm going to plaster this, I'm going to put in a borehole. However, and maybe this is me being kind of a cynic, but I don't get the sense that MPs are that close on the ground level to the needs of the community. And so my kind of take on it is that it's most likely a nagging voter / town hall model, right? Where you have this person kind of constantly calling the MP's office saying, I need a new borehole, I'd like my school plastered, you know, we'd like to put in a bridge over here, and that these particular people might actually be the co-ethnics in the sense that they feel most empowered to go to this MP and say, we demand results. And that, so there's this restriction of the project space because of that, and that might lend itself to possible bias in terms of what projects actually goes towards supporters. And that, again, it kind of flips the question. It says, maybe this is not MPs actually awarding supporters. Maybe this is supporters, these clustered, segregated groups, feeling very empowered and going to the MP and getting these projects. So it's a question of interpretation of your results. So the paper also tends to, with the exception of one portion, regard the CDF as kind of isolated outside of more traditional reward systems, and obviously political patronage did not begin in 2003 with the CDF. So MPs have been rewarding their supporters for a very long time. And the CDF is also likely to be relatively small relative to the larger kind of federal funds that would go into schools and infrastructure and roads. And so the question becomes, how does the CDF then interact with these more traditional forms of the patronage? Is it a complement? Is it a substitute? Who has control over these alternative various sources of funding? And if it is a substitute, how are these other funds now being used? And one idea that came up is that perhaps they're being used to ally non-co-ethnics, right, to make sure that they have enough voters in order to pass the next hurdle. So these are suggestions, kind of the nitty-gritty for this particular paper. One is I'd like some more detail on the construction of the polling station level estimates of the ethnic demographics. And you note that it comes from Harris, but it kind of falls from the sky in the paper. And I was like, okay, I trust you, but, but it'd be nice to see the detail of how you actually crafted these. Number two is it'd be nice if you rethought this definition of co-ethnics, given that we know that there tends to be voting blocks. So for instance, we know that the Kikuyus and the Merus tend to vote in one direction, while the other ethnicities tend to vote in another direction. So it's saying that, so in the event that I don't have an MP candidate that is my ethnicity, that I know that myself and my other co-ethnics are going to tend to vote in a block in the other direction. And this is likely to just improve your results, just to strengthen them. And then for this section on what factors affect the project location with the box plot figure, it'd be nice to see the share how often these coefficients are significant across the constituencies. I mean, I could go through in that large plot and kind of count them, but it'd be nice if you just kind of gave it to us and you were like, largely these are significant. So there's no reason to worry that 75% of these are not significant at all. And then finally, we know that the results are robust to the exclusion of projects that are geomatched below this enumeration level, and when you go to the robustness checks, you look at schools only. But what about when you just exclude all of the non-exact matched products? Like, do your results still hold in that instance? And then these are suggested extensions, because I know you're almost done with this paper, so maybe these are future papers. But you mentioned welfare effects towards the end of your talk, and it would be great to get a sense of how important these CDF projects are when it comes to welfare outcomes. And that's, kind of getting to feedback loops. Is this symbolic, or is this actually substantive in terms of the impacts of these projects? And does it actually matter? So if your supporters view these as like, yeah, they're small, but I called him and he listened to me, then there is like a very, very close and direct feedback loop. But if they see it, and I mean, I think there was a paper actually presented at a conference a couple of years ago on the CDF, where we saw that voters actually don't take into account the CDF when deciding who they're going to vote for. Usually it's ethnically driven, that there's not as close to this causal effect that you're bringing up. And then it would be nice to look at dynamism and allocation choices. We know that around election times, there's this huge increase in CDF projects, paired with a relatively moderate increase in actual funding. And so you're getting a sort of political business cycle here. And it'd be nice to see if you're actually changing your allocation choices over time. So from the day after your election towards the next election, whether your choices and the facts and the factors that lead into that are changing over the course of that period. And then finally, actually going back and fixing the old literature, right? So taking this new finding, and seeing if it actually is a stylized fact by looking at the spatial segregation and clustering findings and taking it to a more aggregated level and seeing if we get dramatically different outcomes now at this aggregated level. And so I'll leave it there, and we'll open it up to other questions unless you want to respond to a few of these comments.
All right. Great comments. Really appreciate them. I certainly can't respond to all of them, but there's some novel comments here that really are going to force Dan and I to think a little more carefully. And one has to do with your point about transferring to private schools or even better public schools across constituency lines. And I think one way we could get at that would be to sort of create buffers around the borders of a constituency, right? And look at reward conditional on sort of being far enough away from the borders that would be very costly for you to send your kid, Of course, this isn't going to get at, in a sense, the most expensive of those schools, which I guess would affect probably the smallest part of the population, which are the boarding schools. But, that would be one robustness check, and it's one that we'll definitely carry out. So the broader issue of, how do these projects get sort of chosen? Is it the MP sitting there and saying, these people, they will get it? Or is it, the constituents mobilizing and selecting? I think is a key one, and it's one that I don't think there's a uniform story to across, the country, and it's one that I think at this point, almost 10 years remote. that we could really get a good measure of. So Dan and I are going to have to think about that, but I really don't have a strong reply to that one. At the end of the day, though, what we can report is what gets implemented. Again, it tends to be where supporters tend to be located, but I think this is an important cautionary tale to include in our paper. On this idea of, symbolic versus substantive, at the end of the day, I'm a political scientist. I don't necessarily think these guys are social planners who are interested in maximizing welfare gains. I have a whole other story about this that is another paper that we can talk about afterwards, but I think it's symbolic. I mean, one of the pictures I showed you here was, Shinyalu Primary School, 650,000 Kenyan shillings, right? I think this is a credit claiming story at the end of the day, and that while yes, there are lots of other sources of these development resources, be it from international donors or the district or local authorities, which is a whole other kind of government. These are ones where the connection between who's doling out the cash and who gets the resources, that connection is very clear. This is the MP's money, right? Well, I mean, the state's money, but they often see it as the MP's funds. On the ethnic demographics, I'm happy to say, if you're interested in how we estimated ethnicity at the very local level, I developed a paper on doing this from names, and it works in any context. In my paper, I show that it works in Kenya, it works in the United States. It's probably going to work pretty much anywhere where there's a relationship between names and sort of group membership identity broadly construed. That paper is now online in political analysis in the advanced access section, so please check it out. Happy to send you a draft if you're interested. Cross-ethnic voting blocks, totally. But we're looking at constituencies, and the vast majority of constituencies, if you're Mero, you live in like Nithi or one of these Mero constituencies. But in the urban areas, I think you're exactly right. That's where you'll see these sort of politically aligned ethnic voting blocks. Our measurement would actually be improved by combining the Kikuyu and the Mero, for instance. And I'm going to stop at that, and I guess we'll open the floor for other questions.
Thank you. That was just a really great paper and great response. One thing that I hear quite often when I'm in Kenya in the field talking to people about the CDS is, and I think this really supports your argument, but it's that the projects vary in terms of like the spatial distribution, but also in terms of how long it takes to complete, and then the quality. In many cases, these projects are listed on the CDF website, but don't actually exist in the field. So I was wondering if you've thought about that and thought about how politicians might nominally spread the love across like their constituencies, but really focus the resources to complete the projects amongst their support base. And because that's sort of like less transparent. People can always see where the projects are, but they don't know if the project down the street is any good. So that was just one comment I had, and but great paper overall. Thank you.
So absolutely right. I mean, length of completion, I think relates back to Sandile's point about electoral cycles, actually, because we do see a lot of projects that just get started in the last year, and I think Jim Robinson has a paper on this, right? You're like, you do this as a commitment device. Well, I'll start this project, and if you vote for me and get me back in the office, I'll finish it too. So I think that point is very well taken. The question of whether or not they're actually completed is a serious one, because this idea of ghost projects is actually something that is quite important. And this actually sort of started off as a failed dissertation project that Dan helped me resurrect. And I went all around one constituency trying to find all of these projects. And it's very difficult, very, very difficult. The National Taxpayers Association in Kenya actually has a series of reports where they did a much more in-depth job of that, given the funding they had. So one of the next steps Dan and I would like to take is actually build some measures of precisely that kind of missingness, because there are a lot of stories. I mean, you can imagine that MPs, that ghost projects would affect supporters more than non-supporters, because, well, the MP can pay off his supporters not to sort of tell on him, right? So, and we could come up with similar stories for the other way around. So hopefully the NTA data will help us, see what's actually going on there. But points are both very well taken.
Yeah, I guess my comment is now sort of extending on that, because I was wondering about the implementation quality too, so you've answered that a bit. And I wonder, yeah, whether the timing would actually help you also sort out sort of the more retrospective versus prospective mechanisms, right? Because you would think that if you're really rewarding supporters for voting for them in the last elections, you might do that pretty much right away, so in the first year, whereas if it's more the prospective, get me back into office, you would think, yeah, you'd start a project the year before the election and then have this incentive for voters to get back to you.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I mean, and I think this differentiation between perspective and retrospective it's useful, but at the same time, everybody's always playing some sort of mix of these things, right? And it's going to be a very muddy waters here. One of the big constraints we have sort of moving forward is 2007, we get no polling station level data because of, well, most of us know what happened in 2007. So that creates, quite a problem. One thing we do have is in 2005 there was a referendum, and there are a subset of MPs who came out on one side, and all of their constituents voted for the other side. So we can actually look at these kinds of asymmetries to try to see, in a sense, how an MP might use the CDF to try to repair relations after being politically opposed to their own constituents. Yeah, but great points. Time? One more? All right. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to be presenting joint work with Ceci Cruz at UBC and Pablo Carabino with at NYU. And basically what we try to do in this paper is we try to understand, we start from the premise that most of our models of politicians think of politicians as in a vacuum. So politicians operate in a vacuum, they have no relationship with their constituencies, and so they make what could be looking like welfare improving decisions or not welfare improving decisions. But if we think very carefully about the way the political systems is structured in a lot of those places, politicians are actually part of institutions. They're part of the social institutions that they operate within, and those might actually affect both the type of people who run for office, and it might also affect the way they perform more in office. So, I mean, there's this typical, for example, Bala and Robinson paper in 2008, where they look at the role of large landowner in Chile, and up until the 60s, voting was non-anonymous, so basically landowner were able to derive a lot of rents from controlling the way the workers were voting. And so basically that creates very big distortions in who can run for office, who's able to win elections, and the type of people who represent their constituents. And so in this paper we're taking a slightly different idea. Instead of, we're going to be focusing on the networks of politicians, specifically the family networks of politicians, and we're going to show that they play a very important role in the local elections. And we're going to show that they do two things. They predict who's going to run for office, and then conditional on running for office, we're going to see they have a strong predictive power in terms of how the votes are going to be distributed. And if you think of kind of family networks being kind of uncorrelated with the characteristics we care about in our politicians once they're elected, that might actually undermine the quality of people that are in office, and that might create de facto bias to run through. And so we're going to want to say with this. If you fall asleep between now and the end of the talk, that graph is basically showing you what we're saying. So those two graphs are the family networks in two villages. The blue dot is the same politician running in this election. In the village on the left, you can see the family of that politician is very, very central. So the dot is kind of in the center of the network. In the other village, the family of the politician is not very central. It's kind of like on the outskirts of the network. And so what you see is in the first village, the candidate receives 60% of the vote, and in the second village, the candidate receives 20% of the vote. So obviously we picked those graphs, and the rest of the presentation is going to be convincing you that there's actually this is a robust empirical finding. There's this idea that kind of candidates' centrality is going to help them during election time. And so what we do is we use a 20 million person data set in 709 municipalities of the Philippines. That's about half of the municipalities in the country. And the very, very important thing with that data is we have non-anonymized observations. So we have the full names of everybody in the data, and we will be able to take advantage of local naming conventions to assess intermarriage links between families, and so we're going to be able to reconstruct the family networks in each of those municipalities. And then from that, we're going to be able to estimate the effect of family networks on electoral outcome, based both in terms of who runs for office and then conditional running the vote shares of each of the candidate. And then we have some evidence pointing in some of the mechanisms behind the effect, because there's a lot of things that could influence, that could lead family networks to affect electoral outcome, and we have some evidence of what's actually the mechanism we think is at play. I mean, very quick outline. So the data, very briefly, we have two things. So we have precinct level results from the 2010 election. So and importantly in the Philippines, there is at least one precinct per village, so we can easily match the polling station to where individuals reside, which is going to be quite important. And then we have this 20 million individual data set, which includes demographic information and the full names of everybody. And so anyone's full name in the Philippines is composed of three elements, so the first name, the middle name, and the last name. Well, I guess the first name is the individual's first name, which is kind of obvious. The min name in this country is going to be the mother's maiden name, if you're either a man or an unsingle woman. It's going to be your father's family name if you're a married woman. So basically, the combination of two names suggests there was a marriage between those two families at some point in the past. And then, and the last name is the father's family name or the husband's family name. So you can see that if, let's see. So let me show you this in a very quick statement. So the node in our networks are going to be families, and we're going to assess links between family every time we see an intermarriage. So this is Noriel Aquino is the current president. And as you can see, his middle name is Cojuangco, and his last name is Aquino. That means that at some point in the past, in his case in the middle of the 60s, and Aquino, his father, married a Cojuangco, his mom. So in our family networks, we can actually establish a link between those two families. And then there's this cousin here, who is a senator. So Bar Maguire Aquino. From his name, what we can infer is there is a link between an Aquino and an Aguirre. So in his case, I think it was in, I guess, 70s or 80s, his parents married, and so there is a link in the network between the Aquino and the Aguirre. And so we can do this with all the names in the network, and we can reconstruct the whole family structure of the municipalities. And you might wonder whether this is an appropriate methodology, but the thing you have to I guess I won't get into a lot of details, but it's just the way the names were imposed by the Spanish colonial official in the middle of the 19th century that allow us to do that at a very local level. Because basically what they did is they imposed new names in the 1850s, and they gave one name to one family in each district. So there was in the middle of the 19th century, you have this shock in the distribution of names, and then since the 1850s, the names have been kind of spread out through generation according to those well-established rules that I just mentioned. So we can do that. So basically, with that information, we can reconstruct the family networks. That's just part of the problem. Then we need to think about what do we mean by centrality. I kept talking about centrality. I put some people on the networks, and I said, those people are central and people are not central. So we're going to think about centrality in two ways. The first one is going to be this measure of prestige. So, one thing I should mention is, while economists have been thinking carefully about networks for the past few years, sociologists have been very, very carefully thinking about the things since the 60s and 70s. And they've been coming up with very, very precise measures. So in this case, the measure of prestige they think about is this measure of Eigenvector Centrality, which takes into account the fact that you have a lot of connections. So but not only if you have a lot of connections, but you are connected to people who are themselves connected to a lot of people. So if I have two connections to someone who doesn't have any further connections, my Eigenvector Centrality is going to be very low. But if I'm connected to two individuals that are themselves connected to 10 individuals, my Eigenvector Centrality is going to be quite high. And so you can get those measures to do that. And then the other one, which is kind of a very important measures in terms of how kind of intermediation and brokerage, which if you think in terms of politics is going to be a very important measure, is this idea of betweenness centrality. And the betweenness centrality is going to measure the extent to which a given node acts as a link between different groups. So in this case, the idea is, if you want to go from that dot here to one of the dots over there, you actually have to go through the red dot, right? So the red dot has a very strong power in terms of how the information flows from one side of the network to the other. So this is the main result. And so what we do now is So we have this data on census data in all of those municipalities. We can measure the centrality of those families, and we know who runs for office. So we can identify the families who run, and the first thing we do is we try to predict who runs for office based on their centrality. And that's what we find. I mean, you won't be surprised that with 4 million observations we get stars, but at least this is kind of consistent. So basically what those regressions are showing you is the probability of running for office are strongly correlated with their measures of centrality, and we control for a lot of things here. So we have, from the data we have, we know exactly the number of relatives each of the candidates has. We know exactly the education level of each of the candidates' relatives have. We know the occupation in which those candidates are employed. We know their age and we know their gender. And we control for all of those things very, very flexibly. And we also control for municipal fixed effects to take into account the degree of competition in each of those municipalities. And as you can see, the results are robust. So this is what you would expect if centrality was an important driver of electoral outcome. You would expect some selection based on centrality. And this is what we found. But then, if you think there is a selection based on centrality, that should also kind of be observed in the vote share at the district level. So here, what we're doing is we have one observation per candidate per district. So the district is the level of analysis. And we basically compare candidates who have high centrality to candidates that don't have centrality, don't have very high centrality. In this case, the results are not very strong, it's a bit weaker, but this makes a lot of sense. Because if you think that centrality is an important driver of selection, is an important driver of electoral outcome, you will expect two things. Either in a district you will have two candidates with similar level of centrality. So actually, once you control for municipal characteristics, you don't have a lot of variation in the measure of centrality. But also, if you're a candidate that's willing to run despite having a low centrality, you must have an important kind of unobserved characteristics that is going to help you win or kind of get votes in the election. And so, in a way, those results are kind of indicative that something is going on, but they're not very, very strong. So what we do is we go one step below, and instead of focusing on the results at the district level, we focus on the results at the village level. So instead of doing the analysis, the network analysis with the full district, we do the network analysis at the village level, and we're going to be able to compare villages where the candidate's family is very central to villages where the candidate's family is not very central. And the key thing is we're going to be able to control for candidate fixed effects. So all the things that you were worried about the fact that, slightly better candidates might be able to be, marry more central in the network, and what would be capturing is the fact that those guys are more strategic, is kind of cancelled out here because we can control for candidate fixed effects. And so what we do here is we basically, as I said, we have vote shares at the village level, we have centrality at the village level, and we look at the effects of vote. We kind of explain one by the other, controlling for quite a lot of things. So we control for the number of relatives all those candidates have in each of the village. We control the number of female relatives they have, and we control for, importantly, both the education level. We have 17 different education categories, and we know the number of individuals in each of those categories. We can control for that, and we can also control for the type of occupation. You might think that more central, more prestigious occupation, you might have more people who are, anyway. So this is what we find. So there is kind of this consistent and robust correlation, effect at this case we want to claim, on the effect of being central and the votes you get. So there's a few things we do to make sure the results are robust. We start by excluding outliers. I think we can exclude both the bottom 20% and the top 25% of our kind of centrality, in the centrality distribution, we get the exact same results. One thing we can do as well is you might think there's like some strange non-linearities in the number of relatives you have and the vote share you get. So what we do is we include one different dummy for each distinct value of each of our control variables. So we end up controlling for about 1,000, we have more than 1,000 dummies in there at the end. The one thing I kind of went through, glossed over a little fast, is what we do is each candidate has two names, so each candidate is associated with two measures of centrality, because the measures of centrality are computed at the family level, and the results I showed you before, what we did is we took the maximum. So each candidate is going to have two measures, and we take the maximum. We get the exact same results if we take the mean, if we take the minimum, or if we take an average of the two. It's fine. And two other things we can roll out at this stage is, one thing you might tell me is it's just about reverse causality. So someone is in power, his family becomes more attractive on the marriage market, and they can marry more centrally. But so if that was the case, that would be something that would centrality would only affect vote shares for politicians that have already run in the past, right? For people who are running for the first time in election, that mechanism is shut down because they haven't shown anybody that they could run for office. And so what we can do is we have detailed electoral data since the late 80s, and so we can run the same regressions, but distinguishing between families that are running for the first time and families that are running for 4, 5, 6, 7 times, and we don't find any differences between the two mechanisms. So that's that. And then you could say, okay, it's just a matter of name recognition. More central families, people are going to know them more, and so once they go to the voting booth, they can kind of write down the names quite easily. And then we can, here to do that, to roll that out, we can take advantage of an interesting kind of feature of the electoral system in the Philippines is candidates run on party tickets. So you run for mayor, this is the people we're looking at, but then you have 9 other people on your ticket, 1 vice mayor and 8 municipal councillors. But the key important feature is there is no straight ticket voting. So you can't just tick a box and say, I'm going to vote for all the candidates on this list. You have to vote individually for each of the candidates. And what we find is there's also a strong positive effect of your party mate centrality on your own vote share. So if I'm running, I'm also going to get more, I get more votes not only in villages where I'm more central, but I also get more votes in villages where my party mates are more central. So it's not just a matter of name recognition, because if it was just a matter of name recognition, the party centrality of my party mate, the centrality of my party mate should not affect my own vote share. Okay. And what we are going to argue is those family networks are actually, we can see them as clientelistic networks, and I'm going to explain what we mean by this. So the analysis we've done so far was done on 700 municipalities in the 2010 election. And here, from now on, we're going to use a smaller survey, but a much more detailed survey in terms of electoral outcomes. So we have only 12 municipalities, 284 villages, but we surveyed after the May 2013 elections. And in this case, we have very, very detailed information on policy preferences and of both voters and candidates. And we have very good data on vote buying. So the first thing here is we don't have the 700 municipalities that we use to get our centrality measures are not available. We don't have them for those 12 municipalities. So instead, we use voters list. So we got the list of voters in those other municipalities. We can OCR them, get the names, and we can reproduce the analysis with that. And the first thing to notice is we can do an out-of-sample test of our previous results on these smaller results. So even in this different sample, we get as well a very strong positive correlation between centrality and vote share. And so there's 2 ways of thinking about centrality in this case. So you could think of centrality as a way of aggregating positive information about voter preferences, and that's something that candidates could then use to campaign a little more fruitfully. So you can think that if you're a candidate in a village who are more central, you're going to know exactly what voters want, and you're going to be able to target your programs and policies to reward what voters want. And so what we have data on, we know we got from candidates data on how they would spend their budget. So they have a budget which is fixed transfer from the central government, and we tell them, how much of that will you want to spend on education, how much of that will you spend on health? So we have that, but we also ask voters the same question. So we know what voters want from their candidates. And we can basically generate measures of how well those preferences and the promises match, right? And we can basically run the same regressions trying to predict the match based on centrality. And there's absolutely no effect. So it's not that candidates are better able to kind of target their policies and programs in villages where they're more central. We can also think, maybe the promises that we looked at are not salient for voters. So we also ask voters to rate candidates directly. How much do you like the candidates? There's no effect on centrality on those ratings. And there's also no effect on the perceptions of voters in terms of honesty, approachability, and experience. So it's not like voters in more central villages observe that their candidates are kind of slightly better. But what we find is there's quite a lot more vote buying in those villages where the candidates are more central. And so we have pretty detailed measures of how much vote buying was going on in this election. And what we find is there's a strong correlation between the degree to which the challenger is central and the degree of vote buying. For the incumbent, the effect is a bit weaker, and we're trying to think about this a bit more carefully at the moment. And what we think is going on is, in the Philippines, the vote buying is something that the challenger mostly do. So if you think of vote buying as something that takes place a few days before the election, if you're an incumbent, you don't have to engage as much in that, because you've had 3 years in office to kind of buy your friends, And so you don't have to engage in that one particular practice before the election. It's something the challenger is much more reliant on. Yeah. And to conclude, what we try to argue in this paper is networks are very important in understanding politics in country without a tradition of programmatic politics, obviously not just in the Philippines. The intuitions for why networks are important are going to be important for family networks, but they're probably going to apply to also a lot of other networks, from clans to castes to ethnic groups. So it's not just about we think of the family in this context as one social institution that we care about, but it's possible that in other contexts it will be a different social institution. But we still think the same kind of system would happen. And so then what we're saying is, we should do more research on the interaction between the social and political institutions. Thank you.
All right. So as a person who's really interested in names as a source of data, I was really excited to read this paper. It uses a really unique data source in a very creative way, and it's actually given me a lot of ideas about how to use similar data in the Kenyan case to look at similar ideas. I'm going to save praise, since we don't have a lot of time. I gave you a lot of that before we started, so and focus really on some robustness checks that I'd like to see, as well as some ideas for future research. That is, like, what are you leaving on the table that you might want to look at next? I'm sure with all of the data sets you already have a long list, but hey, why not add to it? So I was at Nuffield College for 2 years, and I stopped back by there yesterday for lunch, and I saw the porter, and he said, "Oh, I have some mail for you." I was like, "Oh, great, mail." And my name's Andy Harris, and he handed me a mail for Anthony Harris. And I opened it and took Anthony's checks, and it was all. No, the point here is that names, of course, are never absolutely sort of deterministically generating these network links. I think you do have a historical circumstance here that certainly balances the probabilities in your odds, right, or in your favor, and I think that's great. And I mean, as someone who's very interested in the substance of a place, I would like to see a much longer discussion of that, perhaps in an appendix, especially if you can trot out some, archival documents or something that just sort of, give us the weight of this historical evidence, because really your empirical strategy here hinges on that, right? And it would be very difficult to infer that from the data you've observed in the present because of migration, because of differential family growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I really, it would be much more convincing to me if you leverage the qualitative side of things in a much more commanding way, rather than what you have now, which is an interesting paragraph or two. But you have great quantitative work. Just buttress it with some of the qualitative stuff that would give it a different kind of weight. The second thing I do with respect to that really has to do with answering the question, like, how wrong would my assumption of deterministic linkages via names have to be wrong in order for my results to disappear? And so, there are lots of ways you could do this, but I think coming up with a very basic sort of data generating process in terms of the relationship between names and network ties that involve just, if the probability that I observe this name implies that I am tied to a person of the other name, right now, yet that probability is fixed at 1, right? And so how far does that have to drop before your results just disappear? And I think it would take a lot of time computationally, but I think it would be worth it. It would be something that you could code up once, let it run for a few weeks, and then run it at several levels, and then just show, okay, this holds unless we drop things to sort of an unbelievable level. And I think it does the same thing that the qualitative evidence does from the quantitative side of things. And this isn't something that you can really control for in regressions. You do a great job of providing different kinds of regression-based evidence of robustness, but this is really a question about how you construct these centrality measures and betweenness measures. I think the next most important, well, you don't say anything about this in the data set, but the NHTSPR data set, you don't report it telling us that it has information on individuals' marital status. I assume that's either implied in the data or explicit, but that seems important for deciding, in a sense, how you would use an individual's names and sort of which networks they would fit into, right? So that might be something you can add. In terms of things you might be leaving on the table, so other ways you can push this. From the Kenyan perspective, immediately things pop into my mind, like is there variation in inheritance norms, in post-marital residence choices, et cetera, that may have a large influence on the local as well as more distantly spatial distribution of your family network. I don't know anything at all about the Philippines, so this may be a completely sort of orthogonal kind of comment, but it might be quite interesting to see if some groups, perhaps it's Muslim versus Christian, I don't know, have different norms with respect to inheritance, which is of course very important in terms of resources, which of course are very important for politics, as well as for the size of the sort of manipulable family network. I think another thing that I'd love to see is you have this voter register, and then you have this population enumeration, right? So you can get directly at the mobilization issue by looking to see if people in the voter register you have all the zeros and ones, so to speak, right? You know who didn't register, and you know who did, or you know the population, and you know who did register, so therefore you know who didn't register, you know who's come of age and is able to register now. So there could be some very interesting things about, are politicians able to mobilize their family members at a higher rate than non-family members? And I think from a political science perspective, there are a lot of opportunities here for using these voting models of ecological inference, which we've used a lot in sort of racial voting in the US, to actually split voters up into different sort of familiar or Hamiltonian distances from a given ego, and then seeing if their propensities for voting for a given candidate, as well as registering to vote, are different depending on these network centrality measures. Again, fabulous paper, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where you take it next. Great.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, I agree. We should do a bit more archiving stuff. We can go back to the archives in the Philippines and get some stuff on names. I didn't think about doing the probability, like moving the probability from 1 to. So I'll have to talk to Ceci, who's the computing genius in this team, but I think that she should be able to do that. And in terms of variations in inheritance law, I think it would be broadly kind of consistent, except in ARM, which is one region that's kind of predominantly Muslim. We find similar results when we exclude that region, but yeah, maybe it's something we can explore a bit more. There is, yeah, and I quite like the idea of trying to kind of predict who actually registers to vote, and we can try to see what who's being mobilized in a way, and that's really interesting. Yeah.
Just on your results regarding the mechanism.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Your results regarding the mechanism through which this effect could obtain. On the vote buying, you seem that that's kind of that's where you end up saying that vote buying is the mechanism through which family networks seem to matter for electoral outcomes. It kind of went fast. I couldn't see whether in your interaction effect between the challenger and what was it? Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Between centrality and challenger, between an incumbent. I don't know if you included. You'd want to include challenger and incumbent as right-hand side variables. Yeah. If they're not there, then it wouldn't be interaction effect. So you'd want to have, even if you don't show it, if you have included the, of course, centrality, but also challenger and incumbent just as right-hand side variables. Just want to make sure that.
The thing I should be clear about here is the fact that we have one measure of centrality. We have one measure of vote buying per village. So we can't ask voters. We can ask voters who, if someone tried to buy their votes, but we're unable to ask whether that person was the challenger or the incumbent. This is something that no IRB would let us do for some strange reason, I don't know why. So what we left with is we left with a village level measure of vote buying, And then what we see is in the villages where the challenger is more central, there is more vote buying, but there is no effect of centrality for the incumbent. So this is the only thing we can do. And I mean, it is consistent with the fact that challengers are doing more vote buying, but we don't have measures of at the
Variable you have, right?
What?
So maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe we can also sort it out later. But the challenger variable is a variable you have. I mean, this is an interaction between you're multiplying two variables.
I think what the issue here is it's actually not an interaction. This is two things. It's the betweenness of the challenger and the betweenness of the incumbent.
Oh, okay. I see. Okay, in that case,
Yeah,
it's a non-issue. All right.
So a quick question in terms of migration and possible like omitted variable bias. So it seems almost like mechanically that your measure of centrality could be picking up the length of time that the politician's family has been in that village. So I was wondering, and that could be related either through voter preferences or through clientelism like you have to sort of your results, which isn't to do with centrality, but it's more to do with like length of time that the family has been there. So I was wondering if you had data on that, or if you could do. It seems like the way that your measure works differs for the length of time that the names thing holds for differs between men and women. So I was wondering if you could use that potentially somewhere.
I mean, okay, it's one thing we haven't really taken advantage of, but it's true that we have two things. We're actually quite a bit, we're worried a bit about migration, and this is something we kind of, as you say, I mean, there's going to be two things: people leaving and then people moving in. So what we try to do is, at some point we restrict the sample to very small municipalities, which are municipalities that are kind of sources of migration that are kind of, rather than being poor municipalities, and we get similar results. I mean, it doesn't really get at that. We should be able to, I think in the data, we do have information on how long those individuals have lived in the area, and so we could control for that and see if that works. Yeah.
Really fascinating paper. I'm definitely going to read it, and then I'm probably going to understand more of it as well. So first question, probably related to what you already said, what's your own thought about the causal chain here? Like, is it really that the network causes an increase in vote shares, or is it just that these guys are more likely to be the winning candidate because they possess this network before? And then maybe you can elaborate a little bit just on the vote buying variable and how that is measured. And it was quite quick, so I don't remember exactly, but at one point you mentioned you have candidate fixed effects, so I just wonder where your identification comes from in that case.
Yeah. So, I mean, briefly, how vote buying is measured. In the very good thing about Filipino voters, and they're very happy to tell you that someone tried to buy their vote. So in a lot of contexts, there's so much social desirability bias in vote buying that you have to use list experiments to get reliable measures. In the Philippines, you ask people, did someone try to buy their vote in the election? And they'll tell you yes or no. And in some cases, they'll actually complain that no one tried to buy their vote. So, I mean, it's a very kind of open situation regarding vote buying, so we're not too worried about our measure. In terms of so yeah, once we start using candidate fixed effects, we move the analysis one level. So at first, we do the analysis at the municipal level, kind of the district level, and we have one network, one full family network. But then we move down to the village, and we have different kind of village networks. And in each of those networks, the candidate is going to be more or less central. And basically, the identification comes from the fact that we're going to be comparing villages where the family is very central to villages where the family is not so central, taking advantage of the fact that candidates run in more than one village. I mean, a municipality is going to be composed of 20 to 25 villages, and so we're going to be comparing that across. I mean, in terms of causal chain, I mean, it's a tricky one. Basically, the way we want to think about it is kind of a candidate as a network, and a network, they can actually use that network to use a certain type of campaign strategy, basically. And so in a way, if you think of buying votes, it's actually a very demanding strategy, right? I mean, you need to do two things. You need to be able to identify people who, if you give money to them, they're going to go and vote for you. And then you need to find, among the set of people, you need to find the ones where you can actually give the least money to change their vote. And then you need to monitor them, which is going to be quite hard. And so if you think of all those informational demand on the side of the politicians, then having a very close-knit network in those villages is going to help, because if you have those networks, it's going to be much easier for you to identify who to target. It's going to be easier for you to monitor them, but it's also going to be easier for you to kind of punish them if they renege on their promises. So it's kind of like, it's this package of things that networks seem to deliver that we don't really take a side of which part of the network plays a role, but this is what we have in mind. Okay, any more questions? No? Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about how these constituency boundaries are being drawn. So you might worry, sort of, I guess, similar to other omitted variable bias ideas, that if you're a more powerful local, have a more powerful family network, that you might actually be able to alter the constituency boundaries and sort of do yourself a favor in sort of being elected or re-elected.
So the municipalities in the Philippines, a lot of them are kind of from the Spanish time, so it's kind of a very, very old process. There is some new municipalities are created, but the new municipalities tend to be created by breaking up new ones, by breaking up an old one and putting it into two. So in some parts of the country, what you see is, there's been a small tendency towards splitting municipalities. So you actually have a very strong family who can run candidates, field candidates in that two strong candidates. So if they had two municipalities, they could field two candidates, and then they kind of break the municipality in two and get the votes. I think what we could do is we could exclude those municipalities and show the results are the same. But this is, it's not that there's a lot of redistricting going on a very, very common basis.
If there's nobody else, just one question to your really astonishing data collection exercise. What's the variation in names in the Philippines? Because you said a lot of the names were imposed by the Spanish. So is there actually a lot of variation within names? Because if you have the candidate fixed effects and your identification comes from variation across villages, are you actually sure that's really the same family, or is it just that the Spanish assigned the same name to different families?
So the way the names were being imposed, so what they did is it's a funny story. So they asked someone in Madrid to compile a list of names. So there's someone in Madrid compiled a list of 67,000 names. They produced 7 handbooks with all the names. They shipped the books to Manila. And then from Manila, they basically shipped different parts of the books to different provinces. And then within provinces, municipality would get a few pages of the book. And then in that municipality, the colonial official would be responsible for giving one name to one family. And so in theory, there's going to be some measurement error, of course, but the prior is like people sharing a name in a given municipality are going to be related. And the thing that's quite interesting is, to this day, in some provinces, you can tell where people are from by the first letter of the last name. Because they got the A page and the other one got the B page. That's all it worked. All right, thank you.
I'm doing like roughly 15 to 20 minutes.
Yeah. Cool. Up. There you go. This is your, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
You ready?
Yeah.
So in the wake of the Arab Spring, I was having lots of political debates with people, and maybe this is why economists are not invited to dinner parties, about the relative importance of these hard-won political freedoms versus economic mobility, and importantly, stability. And my argument at the time was that, people are really exuberant right now, but over time, this is going to wane as the economic situation doesn't change for them. And whether you agree with that assessment or not, we've seen this in Bahrain now, we've also seen this a little bit in Tunisia. Whether you agree with this assessment or not, the underlying question here is a question of how do we value justice, right? How do we value the imposition of rule of law? And the ICC's indictment of 6 Kenyan leaders provides a particularly nice kind of context to take a first glance at this question. So to make sure that we're all having the same conversation about the incident that happened, everybody remembers the 2007 post-election fallout. And what happened as the dust settled there is that we realized that the violence and the displacement and the property damage was not random, right? It was intentional, it was clear that it had been incited, and both internationally as well as locally, there were calls for the perpetrators to be brought to justice and to be brought to justice swiftly. Almost immediately, the International Court began a preliminary investigation, and then also at the Kenyan level, there was a lot of false starts, effectively, of saying, okay, we're gonna start a tribunal, we're gonna start an investigation, and then backtracking on that quite quickly. So in December 2010, the ICC said, okay, enough, we're stepping in. The information that they had collected on the ground was handed over to them, and they indicted 6 of Kenya's foremost leaders. To give you a sense of how big a deal this was, is that this included Kenyatta, the current president, the deputy president, Ruto, as well as the head of the NSA, the head of the police, the head of education at the time. So this was literally, this would be gutting kind of Kenya's foremost leadership. So why is this interesting? Well, my motivation for looking at this is that this is potentially a new shock, a new political shock that's potentially stabilizing, importantly, and it's also a potentially stabilizing judicial shock. So first, we typically don't look at judiciaries as shocks, right? Because they're endogenous to countries because of path dependency, because of elite power dynamics, and there's a lot of theoretical literature on this, but a good empirical case is looking at Argentina before 2000, where every single time there was a new executive, they would gut the Supreme Court and put in new justices, okay? And so obviously the actions of those the Supreme Court justices there were never viewed as exogenous to the country. But here we actually have this exogenous judicial shock because of the ICC's kind of framework. So of course it has limited jurisdiction over only the most egregious crimes, but also it has prosecutorial independence, which means that once you become a member, or if the UN steps in, there's no way that you can stop the case. So there's no way that a member country, for instance, can veto you bringing a case against the member country. So this is very, very key. It also acts when countries are unwilling or unable to do so. So there are 2 things to think about as we kind of go through this. It's also potentially stabilizing in that it changes agent behavior on the ground. So there's some evidence of this. We've seen violence reduction in ICC member countries. This is Simmons and Joe. It's one of the few empirical papers on the ICC. And what they do is they match ICC ratified states with non-ICC ratified states and see what happened in the years following that in terms of whether rebel groups and state actors engage in violence. And we see that there does seem to be a deterrent effect from ICC ratification. It de-escalates situations, specifically where state actors and rebel groups seek legitimacy. So you're not going to see this, for instance, in the case of Kony, right? He's not seeking legitimacy from a broader population, and because of that, there's no reason for him to de-escalate. We also see this in past international tribunals. So in Yugoslavia, they actually started indicting war criminals during the war, and then they arrested them, took them out of the Dayton peace process, which delegitimized them, and then they were able to actually push through a peace accord, and so we saw the results from that. And then there's also anecdotal evidence on the ground from Kenya. So after they were indicted, Kenyatta and Ruto, you remember that they were on opposite sides during the 2007 election, both supporting different candidates. They forged an alliance called, funny enough, the G7 alliance, and they politicized the ICC case. And basically the ICC, or the election, became a referendum on the ICC and whether the Kenyan community was behind their indictment or not behind their indictment. We also saw that there was some sense of reforms to the judiciary, so they catalyzed a lot of reforms. And the idea there was also, it was to avoid prosecution. It was saying, if we can actually do this on the ground, if we can make our judiciaries independent and competent to actually do human rights cases, which is a particular skill set, then we won't actually have to have the ICC step in. And then we also saw in the 2013 elections that there was no politicization of ethnicity, unlike past elections. And you also saw a large decrease in the use of hate speech. So all of these kind of anecdotal stories on the ground suggest that there is this potentially stabilizing role. And my question is, do we actually see this to data? So bringing it to bear on the data. So there's 3 research questions. I'm using a very kind of simple, standard event study framework using stock market returns to ask 3 questions. So the first being, do investors view the ICC intervention as stabilizing or destabilizing? So are all boats rising or are all boats falling at the aggregate level? And then, and this is inspired by Fissman's 2001 paper where he looks at Suharto, and there's health shocks. There's news about Suharto's health. And we see that politically connected firms to Suharto fare worse relative to unconnected firms. So we want to see, in this instance, is there heterogeneity in outcomes between the politically connected and unconnected firms? And then finally, and again, this work is very preliminary and very much a first glance, and so I haven't gotten to this point yet, but I asked, do the stock market outcomes that I actually observed translate to any kind of change in actual firm behavior, right? And so as a macroeconomist, this is what I'm mostly interested in. Are there changes in investment? Are there changes even in terms of whether they want to be politically connected or not? So whether they have government members on their board or not because of what happens with the ICC, and how that translates, of course, to the macro level. So to give you a sense of where I'm going to go, I'm not going to discuss the connections to existing literature given the time constraints, but I will just say that this is the third of 3 empirical papers that have been written on the ICC, so it's very much a white space, and the other papers look at deterrence. They're not really looking at the valuation of it, and they're written by IR specialists. So this is kind of bringing, an economist's eyes to the problem. So I'll discuss the channel, so how we go from shock all the way to the firm outcomes, the data and constructed measures, and I'll actually spend quite a bit of time on this because if you don't believe my setup, then my empirics won't mean very much. I'll give you a snapshot of the key results, and then if we have time, I'll discuss some robustness checks and falsification efforts, but I suspect that'll come up in the discussion as well before concluding. Okay, so the shocks. So first we get this ICC shock, and again, I question whether all boats rise or all boats fall. And on the negatively destabilizing side, so this literature kind of turns on whether it's stabilizing or destabilizing. And on the negatively destabilizing story, it's just the political instability. It's another form of political instability. You're creating a political vacuum. And even though we might think that these are bad leaders in some way, it's the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. And you're gutting this country's leadership, and we don't know what's going to happen in place of that. So this is all boats falling. And then in that instance, it's a very straightforward story that the connected firms are obviously going to lose their implicit subsidies, and so they'll lose relative to the unconnected firms. On the stabilizing side, it's a little bit more ambiguous. But the reason that all boats might rise is, number one, because you get that change in agent behavior, where there's less corruption. But even if they don't change behavior, there might be this push to have the judiciary improve so that the ICC case actually doesn't go on. So you still get institutional reforms, even if the agents haven't changed their behavior. Now, in the event that you get strong institutional reforms and that there is this decrease in corruption, you almost get pro-competitive effects, right? So there's a more equitable marketplace now that the connected firms are facing, and so now they're going to lose relative to unconnected firms just because they're having to actually fairly compete. And in the case where there's actually no lasting reform efforts, where it's just almost it's just talk, the fact that they actually want to lower corruption and reform the judiciary, then the connected firms are going to gain, right? Okay. So data and constructed measures. So I use stock market data from the Nairobi Stock Exchange. It's the 4th largest exchange on the continent. And it does have an automated trading system, which was introduced in the early 2000s. It has a transaction time of 4 days. So this is not the high frequency algorithmic trading that we tend to think of when we think of the London Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange. However, it is completely automated. And I'm just showing you a few descriptive statistics, comparing it to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So the market capitalization on the NSC is less than 1%, for instance, of the US's market capitalization. So this is a very, very small exchange. However, there are 49 listed firms, and most importantly, foreign ownership on this is about 50%. So whatever I find here is that I'm actually not getting just a domestic opinion, but I'm also getting an international opinion about the effects of the ICC. So in order to do these stock market event studies, we usually have to figure out whether we have a semi-strong efficiency, which means that the stock market prices every day will reflect new news, and also with the correct magnitude changes. And Kenya certainly qualifies as weak efficiency in the sense that you can't predict future prices based on past prices, and they're quickly trending towards semi-strong efficiency. So there's not yet an empirical paper that confirms Kenya's semi-strong efficiency in terms of the NSC, but actually this paper kind of suggests that the Kenyan stock market does respond, and so we'll see that in a moment. And the stock data just comes from DataStream. So in terms of estimating these abnormal returns, Again, a quite standard approach, where first I use an estimation window in 2004. That was the most recent year where there was no major upheavals in Kenya, because in between that time there had been a new constitution introduced, there had been a major drought, there was ongoing issues with Somalia, and so 2004 was, relatively speaking, a calm year, which is what you want to do for your estimation window. So for that, we basically wanted to estimate alpha i's and beta i's, so these parameters for every single firm. So you're just regressing from i's return t on the market return, and then we take these alpha i's and beta i's, and for our actual sample period, calculate abnormal returns in the following way. So it's just a residual of the actual market return minus my estimated parameter, alpha I and beta I, times the actual market return on that day. So it's the firm return minus that. And these are our abnormal returns. And what you're basically getting here is how this firm is reacting beyond normal market fluctuation responses. And from a possible sample of 49 total firms, I had to drop 7 due to lack of availability during the estimation window. So Safaricom is not included in here, for instance, or due to low within month variability, so too much thinness, basically, in the firm returns of less than 1% during the sample period. Okay. I didn't skip one, right? Okay. In terms of event selection, so I am not an international human rights lawyer, and there are countless procedural steps that the ICC goes through, so I was unable to distinguish between the vote on issuing a summons versus the actual issuing of the summons versus a request for a summons. Like, all 3 of these are events that come up. And so I consulted with 4 international human rights lawyers to actually determine what are pivotal moments in this process. So what actually counts as like a flashpoint in the process, including one that worked with Ocampo during the actual ICC early proceedings. So they selected, they kind of converged on 21 key event dates, and so those are the event dates that I used for this. The event window, so I'm going to consider T from 0 to 3, those first 4 days, not only the Jackson period, but also a lead-in leaked news period, where 0 is the announcement date. And then I look at 3 different event windows, 1-day stocks, 7-day stocks, 10-day stocks. I don't go beyond that because abnormal returns and expectation are meant to be 0. So once you go beyond that, everything kind of goes to 0. There's not a lot of significance. Okay, there's 3 different types of political connections. And again, this also is inspired by the literature, where we see that there's different value in different types of connections. And what I did is I just hand-coded board memberships from published annual reports of the listed stock members in the start of the period and the end of the period. And there were over 500 unique board members spread across these firms. The most generic connection is government. And this is whether you had some permanent secretary or former permanent secretary sitting on your board. And the idea there is that, they have past government connections, they can call up a high-ranking official and say, hey, we're having this issue, can you help us with this tender, or something to that effect. The second is ICC board-link firms. Now, unfortunately, the ICC accused, none of them have any publicly listed firms, including the Kenyatta family. They're all private firms. However, some of those companies do have corporate boards, and so I connect those private, corporate, non-listed firm board members to NSC publicly listed board members. And the idea there is that it's an indirect link, right? It's just one call to Mohoho Kenyatta, who runs a lot of the Kenyatta family boards, and then you're getting straight to the president after that. And then finally, the closest connection to Kenyatta and the rest of the regime is close advisors, so inner circle. This includes his personal lawyer. This includes his actually formally appointed advisors. And this was the hardest one to get at. So basically I had to read just hundreds and hundreds of news articles, and some of these were picked up because you saw Kenyatta at the same types of events with the same people constantly. Like, in like the social section, for instance, he's always at the same charity events with the same people, and you get a sense for what his inner circle looks like. One of them I picked up actually because Kenyatta did a public eulogy for the son of someone, and I was like, why would Kenyatta do a public eulogy for someone? And it's like, oh, this person is constantly coming up next to Kenyatta as well. So this was the hardest and admittedly probably the noisiest connection in terms of there's a lot of known unknowns here when it comes to his inner circle, but I do think that I did give it a best effort. Okay, so what do these look like? So in terms of having any links, so 23 of the firms are connected, and this is over 50% and exactly what we would expect. Most of these are government connections. There's very few ICC connections, 4 board connections, and then 8 ICC advisor connections. And then below I just show you the correlations, and there's nothing kind of crazy or standout noticeable here. except that if you do have an ICC board member, then you tend not to have an ICC advisor. So that actually proves useful in my empirical analysis, and I exploit that in the paper in terms of comparing the relative importance of the different connections. So I'll give you a snapshot. So this is just looking at the 7-day shock period, and this is the all share. So this is at the aggregate level now, and these are the cumulative abnormal returns over those 7-day shock periods. And so you see here across the different event dates that they're largely negative, first of all, but you did get some initial indications that it might be a positive shock. So the 2/5/08 was when the ICC launched its preliminary investigation. The market responded positively. But the 10/15/08 is when the Waukee Commission released its report, and it said, if we don't do a local tribunal, the ICC will step in. The ICC responded on 11/11/08 saying, yeah, we're going to step in if you don't do a local tribunal. And then you see more and more news kind of over time. And there's a little bit of a learning aspect to this, because, and so it's like, why did you not just include the 10/15/08 or just the 11/11/08? Why, you know, because the stock market's meant to capture it all at the same time. And the reason for that is because they had no idea who was actually going to be indicted until later on. So Ruto, in his role as a minister, went before Parliament in 2009 and argued that the case should be turned over to the ICC, only to then be indicted by the ICC. And so so there's definitely some learning going on, and it shocks as you kind of continue. Okay, so this is the difference in different specifications. And so what we take away from here is that they're largely negative at the aggregate level. So you get this sense that all boats are falling, okay? And these are all significant. Difference in different specification, again, to get the heterogeneity between politically connected and unconnected firms. So it's just kind of very, very typical. Alpha is just the constant. I've got my firm fixed effects. Beta 1 is going to be the effect on non-connected firms. So remember that when we see the results. And then beta 1 plus beta 2 is the effect on connected firms, where of course beta 2 is our difference in difference estimator on its own. And then to counter with a within firm and within date residual correlations, I clustered the standard errors by both firm and date. Okay, so these are the results. So what you'll notice first is that the 7-day shock coefficients tend to not be significant. This is the effect on non-connected firms. So what we see here is that the market is not levying any kind of aggregative opinion on the ICC as a whole. It's saying, you know, it's being very discerning, basically, in its evaluation. And it's not having any link that matters, or even a government link. That's also not significant. But then we start to get significance when it comes to the ICC board, advisor, and obviously having any ICC link. And you see that this is really driven by the ICC board connections. So those negative valuations we saw were driven by the ICC connections in particular, largely the ICC board connections. And in terms of just translating this, so it's, you know, a negative 0.35 average daily negative return in percentage points. And this sounds very small, but it's very in line with the rest of the literature. And if you take this over 7 days, you know, obviously we're getting kind of sizable effects here. And the way that I interpreted this was the ICC advisor links were very hard to pick up, and I have a sense that these were not known to, for instance, a Goldman Sachs investor that's sitting in New York, whereas the ICC board links are very, very well known. All you need to do is do the exact same exercise. Look at the board members of the Kenyatta firms and look at the board members that we see in the reports, and you can just connect those. So it's a very basic exercise. And so my sense is that it's the publicity of these connections that's driving this negative outcome. Okay. So I will skip the robustness checks because I'm sure that'll come up in the discussion, but I threw kind of the most obvious things in terms of getting rid of the outlier returns, getting rid of overlapping event dates, thinly traded firm observations, so all the normal things that you would think to do, in addition to some more kind of interesting outcomes, which we'll discuss in a moment, but I should wrap up with. But I should say that everything I did kind of just, while you had differences in the magnitude of the impacts, I wasn't losing significance, and you were still getting this disparate impact between the ICC board and the ICC advisor outcomes. And you also still were not getting this change or evaluation happening to the non-connected firms. Okay, so concluding thoughts. So based on this first glance, it looks like the ICC as an imported institution only has value in how its actions connect actually directly to the accused, right? And the publicity of these connections seems to be very important. So you might be able to actually kind of cover your firm by not being public about your connections with the ICC accused. However, in terms of aggregate outcomes, the ICC connected firms are a very, very small portion of Kenya's economy. So there's not a sense that there's a big aggregate negative impact that's coming from this outcome. And coupled with the change in agent behavior, this is kind of a win for international justice, I would say. My prior going in was that this is political instability. It's going to be absolutely negative for the stock market. And so I thought that there would be this large fall overall, that all boats would fall, and that's not what we saw. So I would take this actually as a general win for international justice. Okay, great.
So first of all, I mean, pretty impressive data collection effort, like trying to go and like find all those bot connections and everything seemed to be, you know, must have taken quite a lot of time. I'm not going to summarize the paper. I'm going to go to like 2 or 3 things that I think might help the paper in the future. So the first thing you do, the first concern I have is about the measurement of the connection. So you have a 5-year study period, but from what I understand from the way the connections are being measured, it's either 1 or 0 throughout the period, right? And I'm just wondering whether the connections actually change. So do you see changes in board memberships? And so if that, like, do you actually want to have time varying measures of connection, which might kind of increase the precision of your estimates because you get more relevant measures of connection? Or like, otherwise, what's the rationale for kind of saying that if you connected at any point in the past, that should affect in the future, that's going to affect the decisions now? And especially since what you said at some point about the fact that kind of firms might be reacting to the overall uncertainty by either getting more or less connection. So I think this is something that having more information about kind of how the connections in and out play a role would be quite interesting. And then, actually the last sentence doesn't make any sense, but you don't have a lot of firms, but I think it would be also interesting to look at some firms would have more than one connection, and I think it would be quite interesting to see whether kind of if having a government connection might help mitigate the loss of an ICC board connection or something like this. And so that's something you might want to be able to kind of have interaction terms between the different levels of connection. One of the key findings in the paper, and I think the one you try to push, is this idea of, so for a subset of the connections, the ones that you really had to code yourself and try to find the information about, the effect of the announcement is much weaker for those ICC kind of advisor form. So the first thing is you find a difference between the ICC link board and the ICC linked advisor, but you don't do a formal test of that. I think it would be nice to just like run a t-test somewhere to make sure that the results are actually different. But then I'm not sure you could really argue that those connections were not as well known. So, I mean, I'm guessing the investment class in Kenya is quite small. And so, I mean, they might actually all go to the same parties, and so they might actually be able to observe who's connected and who's not. Like, if I was to do something like this in the Philippines, I'm 100% convinced that kind of most smart investors will know what's going on. So, I mean, one thing you might be able to do is if you have data on this kind of the ownership of each firm by foreign and like national investors, that might be an interesting kind of heterogeneity to explore, because if it's just a matter of the connections being not as well known, there's something that would affect the international investor much more than the local one. And this is something you might want to look at. Because I mean, then if you start to say it's about kind of local investor not being as well informed, I mean, I'm not sure. Like, one thing that could be is just the fact that those ICC linked advisors are not as well. I mean, they're not as valuable to a firm. So if I read the paper closely, a lot of those advisors became advisor at the end of the period. So they were part of the close inner circle, but they only became kind of formally part of the government toward the end of the period. And you might think of a story where it's basically, it's not so much how close you are from a politician, it's how close you are from a politician and whether or not you sit in the government. So if you want to kind of affect the way a procurement process is going to go, you actually have to be in place and start to kind of pulling some strings, which you, being outside of of the system might, I mean, you still have access to the information, but you might not be able to kind of play the game as well as otherwise. Or the other story might be the advisor might be a bit more resilient. They can kind of switch from one politician to the other. I mean, having no knowledge of Kenya, I don't know if that's relevant or not, but it's something people might think. And then I guess those ICC-linked advisor firms, there's quite a few of them in the results, in the sample, and so you might want to check that it's not driven by one strong outlier, because I think you have, for one type of connections, you have 4 firms, and for the other type, you have 8. So just make sure that it's not just driven by kind of one strange firm that's driving all the result. And I mean, other things, so you focus on the ICC news that are directly related to this particular case, which I think makes a lot of sense. But you might think as well of, there might be more news events that are relevant to the case. So if you think that there's, I don't know, like some statements by the US president about the US intention to join the ICC, something that could kind of credibly raise the profile of the ICC or credibly raise the idea that the ICC is going to be able to do its job overall, not just specific to Kenya, that should also have an effect. And this is kind of, that might give you a bit more kind of information to work on. Then, I mean, the second point might not be fair, but like how unexpected were the announcements? Like, did Kenyatta know that he was going to be indicted in a few days? And if so, could you actually pick unexpected trading in the few days before the announcement? Something you might be able to look at. I mean, I understand there's a bit of multicollinearity problem here, but I think it would be nice to see all the connections at the same time. You could get also more precise measures of connections by looking at the strengths of the connection. So, I mean, you don't provide a lot of data, but I'm guessing some firms would have one board member who's connected. They might have more. And so like how strongly they depend on the government might depend on how many of their board members are connected. And then, I mean, you pick 3 windows, 3 days, 7 days, and 10 days. It would be nice for the key result to show like, each single day from 3 to 10 graphically, so we can see how the results evolve. And that's it.
Our lives. Okay, so not using dynamism in connections, absolutely. So this is one of the things I flag as like a next step towards the end of the paper, is saying, it was a lot of data effort in terms of, because you're reading through each of these board members' bios and trying to pick out this data and then Googling to make sure they were there. It took a lot of work, but you're right. I can actually go year by year and pick out the other fiscal years and see if connections change over time. And specifically to my last point of trying to get whether the firms are actually changing their behavior, absolutely. I'm very interested in whether they step back in most recent years from trying to have government connections, absolutely. More than one connection, so the multiple connections, this is not something that I thought of, absolutely, of how an advisor connection would interact with having a typical government connection. I guess because the government connections were not significant throughout, I was like, oh, having a high-ranking government person seems to not be important. And so many companies have government connections. It seems to be like the rotating door that we see Wall Street to the Fed. Like, it's a similar thing. It's like, if you're a permanent secretary, you will sit on the boards for the rest of your life, kind of thing. But it's worth checking out, absolutely. A t-test to confirm that they're different. So I haven't done a specific t-test on the betas themselves. However, that was kind of done in the specification where I included both of them at the same time, and the fact that they were both significant and you still saw the difference in terms of magnitude between the two within the same specification kind of gets to that. No, I take your point, absolutely. It's a good robustness, but I think that's probably why I was like, okay, we're good. In terms of the advisors not being well known, so certainly internationally, and I gave the example of the Deutsche Bank or Goldman Sachs analyst that's sitting in his office in New York looking at this, that they're not going to be picking these up because they're also not reading the Kenyan news in the way that I read the Kenyan news in order to try and figure out these advisors. But I like your suggestion in terms of the locally heavy boards and the fact that everybody locally would know that, and that it's unlikely that international investors are heavily there, right? So Standard Bank, we know that there's going to be a lot of international investment in Standard Bank, which is listed on the NSE, and that they're unlikely to know it. But I really, really like that suggestion in terms of looking at the different board compositions to get at that. So advisors have little value. Okay. So interacting, so I like this, in normal situations, interacting, the importance of an advisor with whether the person is in power or not, I completely would agree with you, but we're talking about the Kenyatta family, right? They're the wealthiest family in Kenya, obviously founding father. They own no less than 10 large firms, including some monopolies in Kenya, right? They're just huge. And so I think it's unreasonable to say that in any given year, regardless of what party is in power, that there would be no value from having a Kenyatta connection at that level. Yeah, but I'll think more about it. Obviously, as the parties go back and forth, but a news reporter around the time of elections said that the Kenyan elite are divided in terms of power, but united in terms of money. And so, we're talking about the same sets of people, even between Kenyatta and Odinga, right? Like, one is the former founding father's son, the other is the vice president founder's son. Like, this is very much the same crew. In terms of the ICC board robustness check, absolutely. So I actually did this. I did this last night. I guess in anticipation of what you were going to do. So what I did is I went one by one, specifically with the IC board, because there's only 4 companies, and dropped it and saw if the results changed or not. And the results don't change. So the magnitudes change, of course, but you still get this key difference in terms of the impact between the board-connected firms and the advisor-connected firms. So I know it's not being driven by specifically one firm. That gave me great peace, and I was able to sleep for a bit. In terms of the alternative news about the ICC strengths, this positivity, absolutely, I can include that. Again, this is a learning exercise, right? It's a question of, because you have to, as an investor, believe that the ICC has value, that they're actually going to be able to carry through these cases. We know that in December, they dropped the Kenyatta case after citing that they didn't have enough evidence. So throughout this entire thing, there's just been like, can they actually do it? They don't have a police force. They don't have their own investigative body. They rely on the local government. When the local government is headed by the accused, they're not going to hand over data. So there is this constant learning thing. And so, I think that there might be some new information in terms of the ICC's posturing as they went out. And the U.S. being like, oh, yeah, we're behind this or not behind this and that kind of thing. Yeah, and in terms of sector sensitivity, so I did do a robustness check that relied on the mean frequency by 2-digit code of how many connections there were so within a sector, and I used that as a control to basically get at whether the outcomes that I'm seeing are actually being driven by the fact that certain industries, certain firms have to have government connections, have to have connections to high-ranking people. Kenya Airways is a good example, right? They're still partly owned by the government, so of course they have a lot of people there. And I found that that wasn't driven by the necessity of having government connections. My results still held. Great, so let's open it up.
Thank you. Great presentation, really impressive amount of work. I learned a lot about the ICC, and I'm looking forward to reading the paper. You listed all the robustness checks that you had, and so I feel a little bit silly to suggest one more. But what I remember from that time in Kenya in 2008 is that Safaricom at that time was more than 20% of the market cap of the Nairobi Stock Exchange. It was huge. So I was wondering if, you mentioned that 50% of the investors were foreign, mostly institutions. So I was wondering if you could use sort of generic market betas, because most of the companies on the Nairobi Stock Exchange at the time were pretty well defined. Like you had, Kenya Airways, Kenya Re, Kenya Power, and so maybe you could use generic betas from the international markets.
Is it generic betas?
Yeah, because I guess you were using the 2004-2006 period to sort of calibrate what the abnormal returns would be. Yeah. So, just the utilities tend to move more slowly and tech moves higher. So maybe you could do that, and then you could preserve some of your sample, and then keep Safaricom in there and see what happens. Because I remember in the Fisman paper, they're looking at sort of neighboring East Asian markets to calibrate the return. But I mean, that's really, really, really nice work. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a few and then. Okay. So in terms of using this Fissman approach with the betas, yeah, so your take is that Safaricom is much more volatile and probably has more international investors, and so I might get even more of a sense for the fluctuations up and down because it's it's not this like kind of established, slow-moving, big conglomerate. Yeah, well, and also much more sensitive to what was going on right then, right? Safaricom, when they like IPO'd at the time, it was absolutely. So, yeah, that's doable. And I could also use like an estimation period closer to the actual beginning of the sample period that might include Safaricom to add them in. You were part of that IPO, so like, when were they actually listed formally? Okay. Okay. So yeah, so I'd have to use the Fissman approach. Yeah, because that would be coming into the sample period. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? Ready for lunch?
Hi, my name is Brian. I'm from Kenya, but I just want to commend you on how much you collected. I know it's really hard to collect that kind of a data, and that data set, in fact, from that period, it was quite hard. So I'm doing almost the same thing, but anyway, I'll talk to you after. And yeah, I'm just happy you did it first.
Oh, thank you. I should say in terms of the data collection, I mean, it's nice to have kind of a straightforward approach, but I realize that there's so many unknowns that I haven't picked up, and I think part of what the next step will be is probably going to Kenya and talking to some of the heads of companies and getting a sense for how accurate my connections actually are. And I'm not sure. I guess there's a question of whether they were going to be willing to talk to me about their connections, given what they've seen in terms of the outcomes of negative hits to the very, very publicly connected firms. But I think that would be the next effort. Absolutely. Thank you, though.
Yeah, thanks. It's really fascinating, the work. Just on the painstaking effort you made to go for part of the connection variable creation, to go through BIOS, as you said, and through material to develop the measure. And I guess that's just one of the measures. You have different measures, right? I didn't catch whether you had elaborated how you did that, but I'm just wondering, and this is actually not my terrain methodologically, but there is sort of formal text analysis and content analysis approaches. I don't know if you've used that or not, but I think if you were to consider that, that may, as you move this to a journal article or whatever, this may come up. And so the more formality you have, even in analyzing text, the stronger your work.
Absolutely. So in terms of finding the advisors, I did have a search algorithm that I wrote down to make sure that I was basically searching the same thing from the day-to-day in terms of the news. So I was always searching for obviously the names of the 6 accused, and then I was searching with advisor, friend, confidant, lawyer, and this is something that I can absolutely add to the paper in terms of what that formal process was. That was a big start. I mean, like I said, if you don't believe my approach and the data, then you won't believe the empirical results. But that was a big part of the push at the very beginning, is to formalize the process of how I was going to pick this up, given that I was going to the news. Yeah, absolutely. But I need to add that to the paper. Any other thoughts? Okay, great. Thank you very much for your feedback. And then did we delete these?